Jeff Bezos at some point says, no, look, I'm so poor. I'm going to he declares no income. He says, I'm so poor that I'm going to claim family benefits.
This is Gabriel Zucman, one of the world's leading scholars on tax evasion and wealth distribution. Zucman's research shows how billionaires today are the only social group that does not pay any income tax.
Now, there's no reason to accept, I think nobody accepts and should accept that the super rich should be allowed to pay less than the average person.
His proposal for a global minimum tax on the ultra-wealthy at a fixed rate of 2% has had a major impact on both academic research and policy development.
It should be consensual. Nobody, should support less than that. Supporting less than 2% would mean being in favor of the right of billionaires to pay less.
This is not only a violation of the principle of equal taxation, but also a threat to democracy. You are often introduced as a rockstar economist. Do you feel like a rockstar?
No, I'm a researcher. I work with many colleagues all over the world who have been doing research over the last few years to establish the facts about how much tax the billionaires pay. One of the most important piece of information in any democratic society, who pays what in tax, but also an issue on which there's a lot of opacity that has just started to dissipate over the last 4 or 5 years, thanks to this international research effort where people in the US, in Sweden, in Norway, in France, in the Netherlands, and in about 10 countries have worked, often in partnership with tax administration, to dissipate this opacity and finally reveal how much tax the super rich pay. And what they found everywhere is they pay much less than the rest of the population.
And as you say, this should be a pretty fundamental fact to know how much different income groups pay in tax. Why do you think that this has been such an information gap until now? Basically?
Yeah, it's a central piece of information in democratic societies where the government takes about 50% of national income in taxes that it then spends and redistributes. And so understanding who contributes to that, to what extent, is absolutely essential. And to be fair, there is some public information on that. It's not a total opacity. What was lacking was what happens at the very top of the distribution. For the really rich, there's generally no official data on their wealth, on their income, certainly not on the taxes that they pay. That's why you have magazines that have tried to fill this gap by producing rich lists, estimates of the wealth of the super rich, but no official data. And the reason why there was no official data on that is probably that after World War II, extreme wealth had largely disappeared in many countries, especially in Europe, because of the shocks of the first half of the 20th century in particular. And so, there was not so much money at stake. And this is what really has changed over the last couple of decades. There's been an explosion of extreme wealth. It's been one of the most striking developments of the world economy. The billionaires, they used to own the equivalent of 3% of world GDP in wealth in 1987. Today, they have about 15% of world GDP in wealth. The rise has been particularly fast and striking in Sweden. And so now, because...
What are the numbers like here?
And Sweden, if you look at the top 0.001% of the population, which
so a
is
couple of hundred
about
individuals.
It's about 50 households, about 100 individuals. They own, in 2001, they own about the equivalent of 5% of GDP in wealth. And today they own about 30%.
Wow.
Okay, so that means that if they spend all their money, they could buy about a third of the value of all the goods and services that are produced in a given year in Sweden. And that's a particularly fast increase, and that both the level and the rise is pretty similar to what you see in a country like the US. And so, okay, now when their weight in the economy is so large, 30% of GDP, it becomes really important to know, okay, do they contribute like the rest of us or no?
And I mean, you're a professor at Berkeley, at the École Normale Supérieure. You've written several books about this, and now you're here in Stockholm presenting this book, Miljardärskatt, så kan den införas, about how to introduce a billionaire tax, a minimum tax of 2% for individuals who have a net worth at 100 million euros or more. So as you say, a couple of hundred individuals here in Sweden. So not even the richest 1%, it's like the richest per mil of the 1%.
The super rich. Yeah.
The super rich. And you've been, mapping wealth and inequality, and this is not the first time you have written in previous books about this type of tax. Yet the curves point in the opposite direction. As you point out, these last 25 years, you have this extreme accumulation of wealth just in Sweden. It's a global trend. In many countries, it looks the same. Why do you think that this development keeps going in the wrong direction, even though the costs of tax evasion and the inequality keeps rising?
Well, of course, the very rich, and that's why we should all care about that. They have a lot of power, including the power to influence policy, to influence the prevailing ideology by buying newspapers and media and so on. And so that's a big part of the reason why there is not a lot of change happening so far. But I have a more optimistic take, actually, on the current situation, because I think that in retrospect, it's possible, perhaps likely, that we'll come to see the years 2024, 25, 26 as the turning point. In 2024, the G20 put on its agenda the question of the effective taxation of the super rich. And that was the first time ever. And these G20 finance ministers, they meet several times a year, over the last 25 years. G7, the same thing. They had never talked about that. It exists since 1975. Not once had they discussed about inequality, about tax progressivity. And that all changed in 2024 when Brazil had the presidency of the G20 and said, look, we have to discuss these issues. These are some of the most pressing questions of our time. And I worked with Brazil then. They commissioned a report to me, and that's when I proposed this idea, which is actually a new idea. It's not a very complicated and complex idea, but a new one in the sense that it's not currently implemented in any country, of having an unavoidable floor for the tax payments of the super rich. Having a minimum tax. You might think, well, that's obvious, right? If you are extremely wealthy, this should come with unavoidable duties towards society, meaning a minimum tax that you have to pay each and every year. But that does not exist. And that's in this report in 2024 that I explained, okay, we should do that. We should all agree on that. Then if we want the tax to be effective, it should be expressed not as a fraction of income, because the whole problem is that the super rich find ways to report very little income, but as a fraction of wealth, which is much harder to manipulate. Hence the proposal for a minimum tax for billionaires, kroner billionaires, or people who have more than $100 million in net wealth, equal to 2% of their wealth. And that has started a conversation in many countries. Then right after that, in 2025, the French National Assembly voted in favor of creating a minimum tax of 2% on centimillionaires. It was blocked by the Senate, but it's going to come back very soon. And the discussion is gaining steam everywhere. We see similar proposals, exactly along those lines, being discussed in Belgium, in the Netherlands, in Spain, in the UK. In November of 2026, there is most likely going to be a referendum in California for a one-off wealth tax of 5% on Californian billionaires. If it passes, it would be the first ever tax on billionaires enacted anywhere in the world. So I think we're at the beginning of a turning point. Now, these are battles that always take a long time. It's not change that happens in just a matter of months, because it is, even though the specific proposal that I make in the book is very modest, 2% is not a high rate. It's just ensuring that the billionaires pay as much, not even more, as I wish they did, but just as much as the rest of the population. Even though it's very modest, they like the current situation where they pay essentially zero, and they find it very convenient, and they're willing to fight, quite aggressively to defend their privilege. And from that perspective, that's totally understandable. And historically, those types of changes, like broadening the scope of democracy, bringing into national solidarity very powerful economic actors who currently live outside of society, in their own parallel society, in their own bubble, it's a difficult battle, actually. So it's going to take some years.
Yeah, and it's an important separation that you make, and that explains this tax disparity, that we tax income, we don't really tax wealth, and the wealthiest, they don't take out their income as earned income. It's in stocks or maybe some in real estate. So basically, what you're saying, the tax system needs to adapt to this new reality where.
And look, the progressive income tax overall is a big achievement. Is a creation of the late 19th century, early 20th century in many countries. It was a big democratic economic revolution at the time, and it was seen by opponents as some kind of crazy idea, and the notion that we could have top marginal income tax rates of 40, 50, let alone 90%, like in the UK or in the US in the middle of the 20th century, was viewed by conservative people at the beginning of the 20th century like something totally crazy. If they had if someone had told them that this is how things would unfold, they would have gone ballistic. But this is what happened. This worked pretty well overall. That really played an important role in the development of the modern tax system, which was central in funding the social state, education, healthcare, infrastructure. That's been the key engine of productivity and growth, and also equality. But this revolution remains incomplete. That's what the studies have revealed. It's that the billionaires have not yet opted into the system. They are still outside of it. And it has taken time for people to realize that. And now the question is, okay, how do we complete the revolution? How do we make sure that we live by our own standards of equality before the law, equality before the tax law, and those who have a lot of wealth and whose income derives from owning wealth, so from dividends, from capital gains, from interest, when you are at that level of wealth, so when you have tens, hundreds of millions, it's very easy to structure your wealth such that this wealth is not going to generate any taxable income. That's what you saw in the US when you had revelations by ProPublica a few years ago on the taxes paid by Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos. And in some years you saw, people like Jeff Bezos at some point says, look, I'm so poor, I'm going to declare he declares no income. He says, I'm so poor that I'm going to claim family benefits. And he receives a check for his children. It makes zero sense, but that's not illegal. That's the way the income tax works. Yeah.
It's a state of mind also. I can manipulate the system to my benefit. If you have
found ways to game the system, to pretend, even though you're the wealthiest person in the world, but that your income is truly low, is low. It's not truly low, but it's low from the perspective of the tax code. Then you can avoid the income tax. And what the studies have shown is that the problem goes way beyond just a few isolated cases like that. It's a structural issue. It's even worse in the European Union than in the US. That was also another big finding. We just need to take that seriously. So to summarize the situation for Sweden, the working class, the middle class, the upper middle class, all pay around 45, 50, 55% of their income in taxes, all tax included. VAT, income tax, payroll taxes, everything. You add up everything. And that's no surprise. That corresponds to the relatively high rate of taxation in Sweden. Again, I think that's a good thing for funding the social state. But the flip side of that is all social groups pay a lot of tax, except the super rich, where, when you move within the top 1% and you go to the top 0.1, 0.001%, the tax rate collapses all the way down to barely 15% for the billionaires.
Yeah.
And once you've seen that chart, you cannot unsee it.
Yeah.
You cannot unsee it because everybody then understands that this is flat wrong. We of course, there is a legitimate debate to have about the proper degree of tax progressivity, meaning the extent to which the rich should pay less than the average person. And it's normal for people to disagree. Should pay more, sorry. Oh, very important.
The extent do we to have which, different views on progressivity?
So, tax progressivity, meaning the extent to which the rich should pay more than the average person. And it's perfectly normal for people to disagree, to have different opinions about that. More left-of-center people will want more progressivity. More right-of-center people will want less progressivity. It's a complicated issue. It's easy to overshoot, to undershoot. Fine. It's always going to be a central element of political debate, and it's healthy to disagree about that. Now, there's no reason to accept, I think nobody accepts and should accept that the super rich should be allowed to pay less than the average person. That is really something that, it's just such a blatant violation of the fundamental principle of equality before the law that we should all refuse that.
And your book shows and your research shows that why it's insufficient to just talk about income or even incomes from capital, that you have to also focus on the wealth and your tax. Let's dig into your tax proposal. So a 2% tax for the billionaires. Why did you land on 2% and why at 100 million euros?
It all comes from this work that I did for the G20, where the idea was to put on the table a proposal that could be consensual in a forum like that, and so that everybody could support. And so by design, you cannot be extremely ambitious. To be very clear, I would be in favor of rates that for the very rich are way higher than 2%. But 2% was computed as the rate that would ensure that all taxes included, the billionaires pay as much, not more, but not less, as much as the average person. And so my thinking was that it should be consensual. Nobody, should support less than that. Supporting less than 2% would mean being in favor of the right of billionaires to pay less.
But can you explain that? You say that it's as much as the average person. The average person would pay much more than 2% of their wealth. So
there's a little bit of arithmetic. So
yeah.
You're right to
it's the revenue that you're talking about.
Right to ask the details of that computation, which there is a little arithmetic that needs to be made. So, as I said, the billionaires today, they pay about 15% of their income in tax. In other countries, it's going to be more like 20%. Their income, when you're extremely rich, all your income comes from your wealth. No, it doesn't come from wages. It comes from owning stuff. That wealth that you own generates income. It has a certain rate of return, which on average for these individuals is about 6%. If you have a tax on wealth that's equal to 2%, it means that's equivalent on average to an income tax of 2 divided by 6, which is a third, 33%. So you add then 33% to whatever they pay today, and you end up, you're back to the average tax rate of about 50%. Right. Okay, so that's the computation. So that's why if you have a tax based on wealth equal to 2% for the super rich, that's going to bring their total tax payments relative to their income, not their wealth, but their income, to about 50%, which is what the rest of the population pays. So again, they
keep getting richer, just not in the same pace.
Very important, which is that with 2%, almost nothing is going to change in their life. Essentially, what it would do is that they would just pay as much relative to their income as their secretary, and their wealth has been growing 10% a year on average over the last 4 decades. So if that continues, their wealth would grow 8% a year. Whatever they're doing today, they're going to continue doing it. Nothing is going to change. Sometimes people say, oh no, but it's a terrible idea because you're going to discourage would-be billionaires. The entrepreneurs, the startup founders are just going to be discouraged to create their startups by the prospect of having to pay this very small minimum tax in the extremely unlikely event where they become so rich, they become billionaires that they are subject to that tax. That doesn't make any sense, of course, because what matters when you create a company is millions of things other than whatever amount of tax you'll pay once you've made it into the billionaire class.
But when you say that this is a question about democracy, because you're not really challenging the economic dynamics that make the rich elite get even richer, able to buy media companies, able to buy political influence. So when you say democratic values, you're talking specifically about the tax system, saying that, okay, the tax system becomes more just and fair. But democracy is still on the line, right? Because of this extreme wealth accumulation.
You're right. And that's why this type of proposal can be and should be, I think, a starting point, but certainly not the end point. This is not what's going to protect our democracies against the risks that extreme wealth poses. The risk of political capture, the risk of tilting markets, the risk of an outsized influence on the prevailing ideology, and so on. So, of course, you'll need more than that. But you have to start somewhere. And the logical starting point, I think, is this one, is to say, whatever we think...
This is the most perverse
whatever we think system about, the world, we cannot condone the status quo. If you defend the status quo, you are defending something that is just so orthogonal to what it means to live in a democratic society, in a society with the rule of law, that is just not possible. Now, that being said, it is necessary, but it's not going to be sufficient. And I want to be very clear about that. This is not what's going to be enough to reduce wealth concentration. Or even to stabilize wealth concentration. Because the arithmetic is, again, quite simple. The wealth of these ultra-rich is growing about 10% a year. The wealth of the average person in Sweden has been growing around 4% a year over the last decades. So if you just want to stabilize wealth concentration, there is a 6 points gap. So you would need a 6% wealth tax just to stabilize wealth inequality to its currently pretty high level. Now, if you want to reduce wealth concentration, you need more than 6%. And I am personally fully in support of such proposals. I worked with Bernie Sanders in the US when he was running for president in 2019, 2020, on his tax program, where his proposal was for a wealth tax in the US that would go to up to 8% on wealth for people with more than $10 billion in wealth. I think it makes total sense. But again, we have to start somewhere. The proposal I'm making is not fixing inequality. It's fixing another issue, which is a serious issue, which is this issue of this anomaly we have in our tax system of the kind of structural failure of the income tax, which, is a problem in and of itself. But it's not fixing those other bigger issues.
And I debate tax policy quite a lot here in Sweden, and something that I struggle with is that the public's perception of the current tax regime and equality overall lags maybe 30 years behind the actual reality, the actual numbers that you present. So there's a struggle to establish that this is even a problem before you can present the solution. Do you think it's easier in a country like your home country, France, that there's more of a, vilification maybe of the rich elite that we don't really have in the Swedish culture? It's very naive. It's like, they create jobs and we don't want to scare them out of the country with too high taxes. What do you think?
People have these beliefs, everywhere, not only in Sweden, but also in France, in the US. Now, I think what's really important, and that's where research has an important role to play, is to establish just the basic facts. Yeah. And so in a few weeks, we will release the study that we've been working on for a long time with my colleagues, David Syme in Sweden, Marius Ring in Norway, about who pays what exactly in those two countries. And my experience has been that once you have a very credible, thorough, comprehensive study of that kind, that's really what transforms the public conversation, because then everything becomes about, okay, what do we do with that? And so my hope is that I think there's going to be some catch-up very soon in Sweden, where people will realize that we can't really continue with the current situation. That's just not okay. And everywhere, you always you have two types of reactions. You have always a small fraction of the population which thinks that the law should be more lenient, more generous for the very rich and the very powerful, and the law should be harsher on the poor, on immigrants, and that's the way things should be. But it's always a small fraction, perhaps 10% of the population. The vast majority wants same laws for everybody, equality before the law. But then you always have many people who think that even though it would be ideal to have equality before the law, it's too difficult in practice because the wealthy will move and we are just powerless. And so that's really to kind of fight this idea that at the end of the day, I tried to write this book to explain why this view is wrong, is profoundly wrong, because tax evasion, tax exile, tax competition, these are not laws of nature like gravity. These are choices that we make by choosing
political will,
by choosing certain policies. And so to be very concrete, currently, if someone has become a billionaire in Sweden and chooses to move to Switzerland, Sweden immediately stops to tax that person. That's the choice that's made. And so it provides an incentive for rich people to move abroad if they want to avoid taxes. But we could do differently. Sweden could say, well, if you've become a billionaire in Sweden and now you move abroad, that's your right, but we will keep taxing you as if you are still a resident of Sweden. Of course, by deducting any tax that you pay in your new country, so that if you move to another high-tax country, you have nothing extra to pay to Sweden. But if you move to Dubai or whatever place that does not tax you, you will have to pay full in Sweden. And we'll do that perhaps not until you die, but for 5 or 10 or 15 years, we can discuss, but you have all these possibilities. And that's the crucial thing to make this billionaire tax work, because in all the debates about these issues, the one recurring argument is, oh, look what happened in Norway, where supposedly, there was some exodus of the super rich. And you always have stories, sometimes real, more often totally made up. But regardless, you always have these threats, these fears that are being stoked of exodus, of tax exile. And the right answer to this is we are not going to allow that. We are going to make it neutral from a tax perspective for people to live in Stockholm or in Dubai or in the Cayman Islands. They can move if they want, but they will pay as much in tax and we will collect as much in tax revenue. End of the story.
Gabriel Zucman, thank you so much for coming to Stockholm, and thank you for writing this book. We'll keep getting the facts out there and hopefully also a solution, maybe in the upcoming election. Let's hope so.
Let's hope.
Thank you.